You think governments run the world, that presidents make decisions, that elections shape your future. But what if I told you the real power, the power that decides whether nations rise or collapse, doesn't sit in any parliament, senate, or palace. It sits behind closed doors, in rooms you will never enter, controlled by people you never elected, operating systems you were never meant to understand. This is the untold story of central banks, the institutions that quietly control money, markets, and the destiny of entire nations. For as long as we've been alive, we've been told that governments run countries, that presidents make decisions, that parliaments create laws, and that nations rise and fall based on the choices of their leaders. But what if that was never the full story? What if the real power shaping nations, controlling economies, and silently rewriting the fate of empires didn't come from the leaders we see on TV, but from institutions almost nobody truly understands? This is the untold story of how central banks, institutions that claim to simply manage money, quietly became the most powerful force on earth. And once you understand this story, you will never look at money, nations, or global power the same way again. Before we go deeper, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn is a world that was never meant to be explained this clearly. Our story begins centuries ago, long before digital money, long before Wall Street, and long before global markets clicked overnight at the speed of light. Back then, kings controlled gold, merchants controlled trade, and war decided who ruled the map. But war needed something more than soldiers. It needed money, lots of it. And this is the moment when a new kind of power quietly entered history. A power that did not fight wars, but financed them. A power that did not rule nations, but owned the debt that nations depended on. Early banking families, like the Medicis in Italy and later the Rothschilds in Europe, discovered a truth that would change the world forever. The one who controls the flow of money controls the decisions of kings. Centuries passed, and economies became bigger, more complex, and more fragile. Merchants needed loans, governments needed credit, trade needed stability, and so, a new invention began to emerge. Something far more powerful than any bank, any family, or any king. Central banks. These institutions did not simply store money. They created it, they regulated it, they controlled its supply, and they did it in a way the average citizen could barely understand. The first modern central bank, the Bank of England, was created in 1694 not to protect citizens, not to grow the economy, but to fund a war. The English government was broke, desperate, and out of options. So private lenders stepped in with a brilliant idea. Let us create a national bank. Let us issue the money you need. Let us lend it to you, secured by future taxes. And overnight, a private institution became the beating heart of the British Empire. From that point forward, governments were no longer limited by the gold they possessed. They could borrow almost without limit, and the more they borrowed, the more powerful central banks became. Every war, every empire, every economic boom, every collapse ran through them. Central banks became the invisible engines behind every major shift in world power. Central banks. By the 20th century, central banking had spread across Europe, Asia, and America. But one bank would soon rise above all others. In 1913, after years of political battles, secret meetings, and backroom negotiations on a secluded island called Jekyll Island, the United States created the Federal Reserve, the most powerful central bank in the world. This moment quietly rewired global power, because the United States, with its vast industry and rising economy, had just created a machine capable of controlling the supply of the world's most important future currency. At first, central banks still had a leash. Their money was backed by gold. There was a limit to how much could be printed, but limits have a way of being broken. 2 world wars shattered economies. Countries printed money they didn't have. Debt exploded, and the gold standard, the last true anchor of global finance, began to break. Then came the moment that changed everything. 1971, President Richard Nixon, facing a collapsing system and rising foreign pressure, broke the link between the US dollar and gold. In one speech, he ended thousands of years of money being tied to something real. From that day forward, money became whatever central banks said it was. They could print as much as they wanted. They could create money from thin air. They could buy government debt, control interest rates, manipulate markets, and influence the direction of entire nations with a single policy. This is when central banks stopped being financial managers and became global power brokers. With unlimited control over money, They gained unlimited influence over everything money touches, and money touches everything: the price of your food, the value of your savings, your mortgage, your job, your future. During crises, recessions, crashes, pandemics, governments waited for one thing: what will the central bank do? When central banks lowered interest rates, economies surged. When they raised them, recessions followed. When markets panicked, central banks stepped in with trillions. When governments ran out of money, central banks simply created more. The world had entered a new era, an era where nations did not collapse because they were broke, but because central banks decided the cost of survival was too high. But this immense power came with a hidden price: a global dependency that keeps the entire world locked inside a delicate financial machine. Every major economy today, the United States, Europe, Japan, China, runs on the same foundation: endless debt, endless borrowing, endless stimulus. And because central banks control the supply of that money, they control the heartbeat of global civilization. But this dependence has created a fragile world. When central banks inject too much money, inflation takes over. When they pull money out, economies slow down. When they try to fix one crisis, they often create the conditions for the next. Look at the patterns: 2000 dot-com bubble, 2008 global financial crisis, 2020 massive stimulus and historic inflation, 2023-2025 aggressive rate hikes that shook banks, markets, and entire nations. Each crisis was followed by the same cycle: panic, intervention, relief, and a bigger problem later. So what does this tell us? It tells us that central banks no longer simply react to the world now reacts to them. Their decisions aren't just financial, they are geopolitical. When the European Central Bank moves, currencies shift across continents. When the Bank of Japan adjusts policy, markets panic. When the Federal Reserve changes interest rates, countries from Brazil to India feel the shockwave. Central banks are not just domestic institutions, they are global engines of power. And yet the average citizen has almost no idea how they operate. No idea how money is created. No idea how decisions are made. No idea how deeply central banks influence their lives. That's why this story matters, because power that goes unseen goes unquestioned, and power that goes unquestioned becomes absolute. But here's the real twist: even central banks are trapped in a system that cannot shrink without collapsing, trapped in a loop where every crisis forces them to create more money, buy more debt, and expand their influence even further. Trapped in a world where global stability depends on decisions made by a handful of people behind closed doors, which leaves us with three powerful takeaways. First, the modern world runs on confidence, not currency. Money works only because people believe it does, and central banks are the guardians of that belief. Second, global power no longer lives in armies or governments, but in institutions that control the flow of money. They do not need authority. They do not need elections, they only need control. And third, we are approaching a breaking point. Debt is exploding, currencies are weakening, nations are struggling to maintain stability, and when trust fades, the system begins to crack. So the real question is not whether central banks control global power. They do. The real question is, how long can a system built on debt, confidence, and perpetual intervention survive? And what happens when the next crisis arrives? One so large that even central banks cannot contain it? If you want to keep uncovering the hidden systems that shape our world, hit the like button, subscribe, and be part of this journey. The deeper we go, the clearer the truth becomes, and the more prepared you'll be for what comes next.